It all started with a letter. One of those white envelopes that seems harmless at first, but once you read it, you realize it's anything but. I opened it, thinking it was just another piece of junk mail. But no, it was a letter from the HOA. And of course, they weren't sending it to congratulate me on my beautiful front yard or my perfectly manicured lawn. The letter was about my security cameras. Apparently, they didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Yes, you read that right. My security cameras, designed to keep my family and property safe, were somehow a violation of HOA guidelines. The letter wasn't vague either. It was clear. I had to remove them, or I would face fines. Fines for keeping my home secure. I stared at the letter for a moment, trying to wrap my head around it. I couldn't believe it. My security system, which I had installed after a break-in a few months ago, was now the HOA's latest target. They were telling me that the cameras, which were discreet and strategically placed, somehow ruined the look of the neighborhood. I was flabbergasted. I mean, I get that some people don't like the idea of cameras watching over their houses, but when you've been through the kind of break-in I had, where someone tried to steal everything from your garage, you don't take safety lightly. I didn't just install these cameras for show. They were there for a reason. But apparently, that didn't matter to the HOA. I thought about ignoring it. Maybe they'd forget about it if I just left the cameras where they were. But I knew that wouldn't work. The HOA was relentless. If I didn't comply, I could end up with more fines, or worse, they could send someone to physically remove the cameras themselves. No, I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't about to take down my cameras just because they didn't like the aesthetic of them. I had every right to protect my home. I wasn't going to back down, and I wasn't going to let them bully me into doing something that could put my family at risk. I grabbed my phone and called a security company that specialized in discreet, high-tech cameras. I wasn't going to remove the ones I already had. I was going to add more. The plan was simple. I would add more cameras, make them even harder to spot, and make it impossible for the HOA to tell me to remove them. The HOA couldn't tell me how to secure my house, and they sure as hell couldn't control my right to protect my family. I wasn't just going to comply. I was going to make a statement. I wasn't about to let anyone tell me how to run my household, especially not some HOA that thought it could control every little thing about the neighborhood. So, I got to work. I hired a team to install new cameras, ones that were even more discreet than the previous ones. I had them put in cameras that could record in complete darkness, ones that could capture high-definition video from far distances. I didn't just want a few cameras to get by with. I wanted a full security system that could cover every corner of my property. The new cameras were placed high up on the roof, hidden in trees, and even tucked inside decorative elements of the house. They were everywhere, but you'd never notice them unless you were looking for them. I knew the HOA wouldn't be able to do anything about it. But that's when things took an interesting turn. The HOA, of course, didn't give up. A few days after the installation, I got another letter. This time, it wasn't just about the original cameras. It was about all the new ones I had installed. They weren't happy, and they wanted me to take them down. I laughed when I read it. There they were again, trying to control my property. I couldn't believe it. The audacity of these people. They had no right to tell me what I could and couldn't do with my own home. This wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. This was about control. I wasn't about to give up without a fight. I knew I had to take a stand. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me, and I wasn't going to remove my cameras. But I also knew that the HOA wouldn't back down without a fight either. That's when I made my next move. I knew the HOA wouldn't just stop after one letter, and I certainly wasn't going to remove my cameras just because they said so. So, I started doing my research. I wasn't just fighting for my right to keep my home secure. I was about to dig into everything the HOA had ever done to me and my neighbors. I wanted to know their limits, their bylaws, and how far they could actually push me. I wasn't a lawyer, but I was smart enough to know that the HOA couldn't control everything. They could make suggestions, send letters, and impose fines, but they couldn't tell me how to secure my property. Not without a legal reason. And there was no way they could argue that my cameras were violating any real law. So, I took the time to go over the HOA's community guidelines, the property deeds, and the neighborhood zoning laws. I spent hours digging through public records and legal documents, making sure I knew every rule I was dealing with. I even went as far as to ask my neighbors if they had ever gotten into trouble with the HOA, and sure enough, Many of them had. The HOA had been slowly growing more overbearing for years, picking fights with homeowners over everything from the color of mailboxes to the height of hedges. But when it came to things like security and property protection, they had no business stepping in. The more I looked into it, the angrier I became. I wasn't about to let them treat me like a criminal just for trying to keep my family safe. So, when I got the next letter from the HOA, I wasn't surprised, but I was ready for it. The letter was the usual threatening kind. More fines, more demands, and even a warning that they would take further action if I didn't comply with their request to remove the cameras. The letter made it clear that the HOA was serious about their aesthetic standards, and they wanted all cameras on my property removed immediately. I folded the letter slowly, trying to control my frustration. I was done dealing with their nonsense. This wasn't about cameras anymore. This was about control, about me standing my ground. I took a deep breath and sat down at my desk, pulling out a folder I had been keeping with all my notes on the HOA and their bylaws. I started writing an email to the HOA president. I wasn't just going to take this lying down. I was going to fight back, and I was going to make sure they knew I wasn't afraid. The email was short, polite, but firm. I reminded them of my right to keep my property secure and stated that I would not be removing the cameras. I included references to neighborhood security laws and made it clear that I had done my homework. I also made it known that I was more than willing to take this to court if they tried to enforce their demands any further. But I didn't stop there. I knew the HOA would just ignore my email, or worse, try to punish me even more. So, I sent copies of the email to several of my neighbors who had been affected by the HOA's rules in the past. If I was going to stand up to these people, I wasn't going to do it alone. The next morning, I got a response from the HOA president. It was exactly what I expected. A long-winded email full of legal jargon, claiming that I was in violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines, and that they had the right to fine me and make me remove the cameras. They even suggested that I work with the community to resolve the issue. I could feel my blood pressure rising as I read through their response. They were still acting like they were in control, still pretending that they had the authority to tell me what to do. But I wasn't backing down. I drafted another email, this time copying in more of my neighbors, and sent it to the president. This one was a little more direct. I pointed out that the HOA was overstepping its bounds, and I reminded them that there were no specific rules in the bylaws that gave them the right to tell me how to protect my home. I also informed them that I had already consulted with a lawyer and that I was fully prepared to fight this in court if necessary. I felt good about it. I wasn't just sitting back and letting them push me around anymore. I was fighting back, and I had a plan. But just when I thought things might calm down, something unexpected happened. A few days after sending that last email, I noticed a car parked outside my house. It was one of those dark sedans you see in movies, the kind that just screams, official business. I didn't recognize the car, but I figured it was one of the HOA's goons coming to deliver more nonsense. Sure enough, as I walked closer, I saw two men in suits getting out of the car. I didn't have to ask. They were from the HOA. The same men who had sent all those letters and tried to bully me into submission. My heart started to race. I wasn't sure what they were here for, but I wasn't about to stand there and let them intimidate me again. I walked up to them, feeling the adrenaline surge through me. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. One of the men stepped forward, a smug look on his face. "We're here to discuss the security cameras on your property," he said, his tone businesslike but with a hint of condescension. "Is that so?" I replied, crossing my arms. "And what exactly do you want to discuss?" The man glanced at his partner, who was holding a clipboard. "We've been instructed to come by and remind you of the HOA guidelines. We've given you multiple notices, and you haven't complied with the requests to remove your security cameras. If you don't remove them within the next 48 hours, there will be legal consequences." I couldn't believe it. These guys were standing in front of me, acting like they were the law, dictating what I could and couldn't do with my property. I knew they didn't have a leg to stand on legally, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try to make my life difficult. I took a step closer, looking the man in the eye. "Let me make this clear. I'm not taking down my cameras. I've already told you this. And there's nothing in your guidelines that says I have to. You're trespassing on my property, and if you don't leave, I'll call the police." The man's expression didn't change. He wasn't fazed by my words. Instead, he looked at his partner and nodded. "Is that so?" the second man said, taking a step forward, his hand resting on the clipboard like it was a weapon. "Well, we've been instructed to report you if you refuse to comply. You're already in violation of community standards." I felt the anger bubbling up inside me, but I stayed calm. "You can report me all you want, but I'm not taking down my cameras. You're wasting your time. This isn't about community standards. This is about control. You can't tell me how to protect my home. You have no authority here." The first man seemed to pause, as if my words were sinking in. But then, as if on cue, he straightened up and said, "You've been given multiple chances. If you don't comply, we will have no choice but to escalate this further." I knew exactly what he meant. Escalation meant fines. It meant more threats. It meant more harassment. But it also meant they were desperate. And desperation made people do stupid things. I wasn't going to let them bully me anymore. I stood my ground, my posture firm. "Go ahead and escalate. I'm ready for whatever you throw at me. But just know that I'm not backing down. My family's safety comes first." The two men exchanged a look. It was like they were trying to figure out their next move. They didn't say anything for a long moment, and I could tell they were trying to figure out if I was bluffing or if I really meant it. But I wasn't bluffing. I was done letting them push me around. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, the man with the clipboard stepped back and looked at his partner. "We'll be in touch," he muttered, before turning and walking back to the car. I didn't move. I stood there, watching them leave, a sense of victory swelling in my chest. But I knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. They wouldn't let up so easily. A few minutes after they drove off, I took a deep breath and went inside. I wasn't about to let the HOA get away with this. I grabbed my phone and called a lawyer. It was time to take this fight to the next level. If they wanted a battle, they were going to get one. But as I sat there, making the call, something in the back of my mind was nagging at me. I'd only done half the job. I needed to make a bigger statement. If the HOA wanted to keep pushing me, I would push back harder. And I had just the plan to do it. I spent the next few days gathering evidence. I wasn't going to let the HOA win this time. I was prepared to go to court if I had to, but I needed to make sure I had everything lined up. I pulled out my property deeds, reviewed my previous communication with the HOA, and even started compiling a list of all the absurd fines they tried to levy against me in the past. The more I dug, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about my cameras anymore. It was about standing up to a group that had been abusing its power for years. I also knew that I wasn't the only one in the neighborhood who had dealt with the HOA's nonsense. Over the years, they had made life difficult for more than a few residents. Some of my neighbors had even talked about moving because they couldn't deal with the constant hassle. But no one ever stood up to them. Not really. They'd all just taken it, hoping the HOA would back off eventually. Not me. I wasn't about to let them bully me, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let them mess with my family. I called a few of my neighbors who had also been on the receiving end of the HOA's demands. We'd all talked about it before, but this time, I wasn't just venting. This time, we were going to do something about it. One of my neighbors, Jim, had been fined multiple times for trivial reasons, like his fence being a few inches too high, or his lawn not being up to standard. Another neighbor, Lisa, had been harassed for having a small vegetable garden in her backyard, even though it didn't violate any actual laws. We were all fed up, but together, we were stronger. I told them about my plans to challenge the HOA, and they were all in. We weren't going to just fight this battle alone. We were going to expose the HOA for what it was and show everyone in the neighborhood that we didn't have to put up with it anymore. The first thing we did was contact a lawyer. I had already gotten a recommendation from a friend, someone who had dealt with HOA disputes before. The lawyer was confident that we had a strong case, but he advised that we start small. We needed to gather more evidence before we could take it to court. So, we began documenting everything, every letter, every interaction, and every fine. But I wasn't just sitting around waiting for the lawyer to do his thing. I decided to take it one step further. I knew that the HOA's biggest weakness was its image. They liked to present themselves as this well-run, community-driven organization, but in reality, they were nothing more than a group of people who liked to control everyone's lives. I was going to make sure the rest of the neighborhood knew what they were really like. I reached out to the local newspaper, explaining the situation and how the HOA was overstepping its bounds. The journalist I spoke to was interested right away. They had heard rumors about the HOA's shady practices, but had never had anyone willing to go public with it. I promised to share everything I had, evidence, letters, and even my personal experience with their threats. Once the journalist got involved, it was like the floodgates opened. Neighbors who had been silent for so long started speaking up. They were tired of being afraid of the HOA, tired of living in fear of fines for every little thing they did. One by one, I began to hear from people who wanted to join the fight, people who were ready to stand up for their rights. The news story ran a few days later, and the response was immediate. The community was buzzing with outrage. People who had never spoken a word about the HOA before were now openly discussing how much they hated the constant fines, the ridiculous rules, and the way the HOA had been bullying them for years. It was like a movement was starting, and I was at the forefront of it. But the HOA wasn't backing down. No, they were too proud and too used to getting their way. I knew they would try to push back even harder now that the story had gone public. And that's exactly what they did. A few days after the article ran, I got another letter from the HOA. This one was different, though. It wasn't just about the cameras. They were now threatening legal action. They claimed that the cameras were a violation of my property rights, that they ruined the neighborhood's aesthetic, and that they were prepared to take me to court if I didn't remove them immediately. I laughed when I read it. I wasn't scared anymore. They could threaten all they wanted, but I had the upper hand now. The community was behind me, and I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. I called my lawyer again, and he assured me that we were in the right. The HOA didn't have the legal grounds to do anything. They were just trying to intimidate me. I decided it was time to escalate things further. If the HOA wanted to go to court, then let's go. I wasn't backing down. I had already proven I wasn't afraid of them, and now I was going to prove that I was willing to fight for what was right. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, emails, and phone calls. I was done playing their game. I had all my evidence lined up, and I was ready to take this to court. But I knew that the HOA wasn't going to give up easily. They had too much pride, too much control over the neighborhood. They weren't used to someone standing up to them, and they weren't going to back down without a fight. I met with my lawyer, and we went over everything one last time. He assured me that I had a solid case. The HOA couldn't dictate how I secured my property. Their threats were empty, and they had no legal right to remove my cameras. But even with the legal backing, I knew the real battle was going to be in the court of public opinion. That's when I decided to take it to the next level. If the HOA wanted to make this a public fight, then I was going to make sure the whole neighborhood knew what they were really up to. I started organizing a community meeting. I sent out flyers, emailed everyone I could, and even knocked on a few doors to make sure people showed up. The HOA had been using fear to control people for too long, but now it was time to show everyone that they didn't have to live like this. The meeting wasn't just going to be about my cameras. It was going to be about standing up to the HOA, about taking back control of our neighborhood. The day of the meeting arrived, and the turnout was overwhelming. It seemed like everyone was fed up with the HOA's tactics. People showed up who I didn't even know, people who had kept quiet for years, afraid of the fines and the constant scrutiny. But now, they were ready to speak up. Together, we were stronger. I started the meeting by explaining what had happened to me, how the HOA had tried to remove my security cameras just because they didn't like the way they looked. I showed them the letters, the fines, and the threats. But I also told them about the stories of my neighbors, people who had been harassed for trivial things like their lawn not being perfect or their fences being too tall. The room was filled with murmurs of agreement. People were angry, and I could see the fire in their eyes. They weren't afraid anymore. One by one, others spoke up. Lisa, who had been harassed for her garden, told her story. Jim, who had been fined for his fence, shared his experience. We were all in this together, and the more we shared, the more we realized how deep the HOA's control ran. But the more we spoke out, the more we realized that we didn't have to be afraid anymore. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer about individual battles. It was about the community standing together and fighting back against an oppressive system that had been in place for far too long. The HOA wasn't just a nuisance anymore. They were a bully, and it was time to take them down. As the meeting wrapped up, I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. The fight wasn't over, but we were ready. We had the support of the entire neighborhood, and we weren't going to let the HOA push us around any longer. A few days later, I got a call from my lawyer. He had some good news. The HOA had decided to back down. After all the publicity, the community meeting, and the pressure from both the media and the residents, they realized they couldn't win this fight. They dropped the case and issued an apology for all the harassment. They even promised to review their policies and make sure they were no longer overstepping their bounds. I couldn't believe it. We had won. The HOA had backed down, and I was still standing strong. But more importantly, the entire neighborhood had stood together and fought back. We had proven that we didn't have to live under the thumb of an overbearing organization. We had taken control of our own lives, and that felt like a victory that was bigger than just my cameras. The next day, I walked outside, looking at my security cameras, still there, still protecting my family, and I couldn't help but smile. They thought they could intimidate me. They thought they could control me. But in the end, I had the last laugh. And as for the HOA, well, let's just say that after this experience, I don't think they'll be messing with me or anyone in this neighborhood again anytime soon. It all started when the HOA decided they had enough of my security cameras. I had been living in this peaceful neighborhood for about 2 years. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and for the most part, people keep to themselves. I liked it. It was quiet, safe, and my backyard was my little sanctuary. But all of that changed the day the HOA knocked on my door. I'd been having a few minor issues with neighbors, nothing major, but over time, things started getting a little weird. I started noticing that some of my neighbors would walk around my property or peer over my fence when they thought I wasn't looking. I'm not paranoid, but when you've had your car broken into before, you start to get cautious. I didn't want to take chances, so I decided to install security cameras around my yard. Just a few small ones that covered the main areas. I even put up a couple on the corners of my house, facing the driveway, the back door, and along the fence. Everything was installed professionally, and I made sure to let everyone know. There were signs everywhere saying property protected by cameras. For a while, everything was fine. I felt secure. My neighbors went about their business, and I went about mine. But then, one day, things took a turn. I came home from work, and my mailbox had a letter from the HOA. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just sending out the usual neighborhood newsletter or something. But when I opened it, I saw that wasn't the case. The letter was a formal complaint about my security cameras. The HOA was demanding that I take them down. Apparently, they didn't like the idea of me monitoring my own property. They claimed that the cameras were an eyesore and violated some vague neighborhood aesthetics rule. At first, I thought it was a joke. I mean, we live in 2025. It's not like I was installing giant floodlights or something. These were small, discreet cameras that blended in with my property. They weren't even visible from the street. But the HOA didn't seem to care. I decided to ignore it at first. I didn't think they could really make me do anything. After all, I was just protecting my property. But a few days later, I got another letter. This time, it was a formal warning. The HOA was threatening fines if I didn't remove the cameras. They claimed they had received complaints from some of my neighbors. I couldn't believe it. I'd always kept to myself. I never bothered anyone. And now the HOA was stepping in because I was protecting my own home? It didn't sit right with me. I tried calling the HOA office to get some clarity. The person I spoke with on the phone was polite but firm. They told me that I had to comply with the rules and remove the cameras. When I asked why, they just repeated the same vague reasoning about neighborhood standards. I was getting frustrated. This wasn't just about cameras. It was about control. They were trying to dictate how I live on my own property. That's when I made up my mind. I wasn't going to take the cameras down. In fact, I was going to install more. If they wanted to push me, they were about to see just how far I'd go to protect my home. But before I did anything drastic, I thought I'd go the legal route. I started researching my rights and the HOA's jurisdiction. It didn't take long to realize that they had no real authority over my security system. I wasn't violating any laws, and the cameras were on my property. I had every right to keep them. Armed with this new knowledge, I started making plans. I wasn't just going to add a few more cameras. I was going to surround my property with them. If the HOA was going to push me, I was going to make sure there was no way they could argue with what I was doing. I reached out to a company that specialized in home security systems and scheduled an appointment. The technician was friendly, and when I told him about the HOA's demands, he couldn't believe it. He said, "You have every right to secure your home however you want. Let's make sure they really understand what that means." A week later, I had a full security system installed, cameras on every corner of my property, covering every angle. I even added a few extra to the back fence, just to make sure no one could try anything funny. The cameras weren't obvious, but they were definitely there. I wasn't going to back down, not now, and I was sure as heck not going to let anyone, especially not the HOA, tell me how to protect my own property. The next day, I went out and bought a few more property protected by cameras signs, and I put them up all around my yard. I was ready. The HOA had no idea what was coming next. But the real surprise came when I got a call from the HOA office a few days later. The same person who had spoken to me before was now telling me that they wanted to come by and inspect my property. Apparently, they had received another complaint, and they were serious about enforcing the rules this time. I was ready for them. The moment they showed up, I was going to stand my ground. If they thought I was going to take down my security cameras, they were in for a shock. But what happened next? Well, that's where the real drama began. The next morning, the HOA team showed up unannounced. They sent two representatives, a man named Dave and a woman named Linda. When they rang my doorbell, I opened it with a smile, but I could tell right away that they were not here for small talk. "Good morning," Dave said, his tone professional, but with a hint of irritation. "We need to discuss the situation with your security cameras. The board has reviewed the matter, and we're asking you to remove them immediately." I didn't waste any time. "I'm not removing them," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I have every right to protect my property, and I've researched the rules. You can't force me to take them down." Dave looked at Linda, and she shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't sure how to respond. It was clear they didn't expect someone to push back so hard. The HOA members usually dealt with people who just followed the rules without questioning anything. But I wasn't like that. Dave took a deep breath and said, "Well, we'll have to report this to the board again. If you don't comply, you could face fines." I didn't flinch. "Go ahead," I said. "I'm not removing my cameras. If anything, I've added more. You'll see them all around my property. They're there to stay." Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting me to escalate the situation. She glanced at Dave and then back at me. "This isn't the way to handle it," she said, her voice lowering. "We could be taking legal action, you know. The board is serious about this." I looked them both in the eyes. "I don't care what the board wants. They don't own my property, and they have no say over how I protect it. If the cameras bother you, that's your problem, not mine." There was a tense silence between us, the kind that stretched on longer than anyone was comfortable with. They clearly weren't used to this level of resistance, and I could see they were trying to figure out how to handle me. After a few moments, Linda spoke again, her voice softer but still firm. "Fine, but we'll be reporting this back to the board. Don't say we didn't warn you." I nodded, not saying anything else. I wasn't backing down. They had no legal right to tell me how to secure my home, and I wasn't going to be intimidated by vague threats. As soon as they left, I immediately went online and started looking into what actions the HOA could actually take. I read through the bylaws, consulted some legal forums, and even reached out to a few friends who were familiar with HOA rules. It didn't take long to realize that the HOA couldn't do anything that wasn't directly related to the shared community areas or enforce rules outside their jurisdiction. The more I learned, the more confident I became. I knew they couldn't force me to remove my cameras, and they sure as heck weren't going to bully me into submission. In fact, I started to feel a bit of satisfaction from all this. The HOA was used to walking all over people, pushing their weight around. But now, they were facing someone who wasn't going to let them get away with it. A few days passed, and I didn't hear from the HOA again. I figured that was the end of it. They had been warned. But then, one afternoon, I walked into my backyard and noticed something strange. A few of my neighbors, who I had always gotten along with, were standing at the fence, talking to each other and pointing at the cameras. I felt a pit in my stomach. Had they called the HOA again? Were they going to start complaining about my cameras too? I walked over to the fence, trying to keep my cool. Hey, what's going on? I asked them, trying not to sound defensive. One of my neighbors, a woman named Sarah, turned to me with a raised eyebrow. You're really going to leave all these cameras up? People are starting to talk about them. I wasn't surprised. People had always been a little nosy in this neighborhood, but I wasn't about to let that sway me. They're staying, I said firmly. My property, my rules. If anyone has a problem with it, they can come talk to me directly. Sarah exchanged an uncomfortable look with the others. I mean, I get it, but it just feels invasive, you know? Yeah, another neighbor chimed in. It's like you're watching everyone. I could feel my patience wearing thin. I wasn't in the mood to explain myself to anyone. Look, if you feel uncomfortable, that's not my problem, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But these cameras are here to protect me and my family. I'm not going to apologize for that. They didn't respond right away. They just stood there for a moment, seemingly unsure of how to react. Finally, Sarah spoke up again, her voice softer this time. Okay, we get it. Just don't let it cause more problems, all right? I nodded, relieved that the conversation didn't escalate further. But I knew this wasn't over. The HOA was still in the background, and they weren't going to just let it go. They were likely plotting their next move. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had the law on my side, and I wasn't going to back down. The next few days were tense. I kept an eye on my cameras, just to make sure no one tried anything sneaky. But nothing happened. No new complaints from neighbors, no more letters from the HOA. It seemed like they were waiting for me to make a move. Then, one day, I received an email from the HOA. They had scheduled a meeting to discuss my cameras and the so-called neighborhood disturbance. They were inviting me to attend and resolve the issue. It felt like a challenge. They thought they could intimidate me into backing down. But they were wrong. I wasn't going anywhere. The meeting was set for the next week, and I was going to show them exactly why they couldn't bully me. What would happen at that meeting? Let me tell you, it wasn't what the HOA expected. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd been preparing for this moment for days. I'd gathered all my research, printed out copies of the neighborhood's rules, and even took screenshots of the conversations I'd had with my neighbors. If they were going to accuse me of anything, I was going to make sure they knew I was well prepared. I showed up early to the HOA office, where the meeting was scheduled. The room was small but formal, with a long wooden table and several uncomfortable-looking chairs. I could already see some familiar faces, board members who had been a little too quick to side with Karen during my last encounter. But today, I wasn't the one who was nervous. I took a seat and waited. The board members trickled in one by one, with some greeting me politely, others giving me sideways glances. But nobody said anything outright yet. Then, the meeting began, and the board president, a man named Greg, called everyone to order. "Thank you for coming," Greg started, his voice carrying a hint of authority. "As we know, we are here today to discuss the ongoing issue with Mr., my last name, and the security cameras he has installed on his property. We've received several complaints from neighbors, and it's time to address this." I could feel the tension in the room. Karen was sitting at the head of the table, looking smug as ever, as if she had already won this battle. But I wasn't intimidated. Greg continued, "We've heard from some residents that these cameras are an eyesore and are making them feel uncomfortable. This is about the well-being of the community. We need to make sure everyone is in compliance with the rules and maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood." I raised my hand before anyone could continue. "Actually, I'd like to speak," I said, calmly but with confidence. Greg nodded, giving me the floor. "I've done my research," I began. "The cameras are legally on my property, and I've made sure everything complies with the neighborhood's regulations. The HOA has no right to tell me how I protect my home. These cameras aren't just for security. They're there to make sure my family is safe. And the idea that anyone feels uncomfortable because of them is ridiculous. The cameras are discreet and positioned to monitor my property, not intrude on anyone else's." The board members looked at each other, murmuring amongst themselves. Some seemed surprised by my confidence, while others just seemed annoyed that I wasn't backing down. Karen, of course, had a look on her face like she was about to explode, but I wasn't done yet. I want to make it clear, I continued, that these cameras are there to protect my property. I'm not asking anyone's permission to have them. I've followed all the rules, and I'm not going to remove them just because a few people feel uncomfortable. This is my home. You can't dictate how I protect it. Karen slammed her hands on the table. This is ridiculous, she shouted, her voice high-pitched with anger. You can't just go around installing cameras all over your property and violating the privacy of everyone around you. This is not just about you. It's about the community. I stood my ground. This isn't about privacy, Karen. I'm not monitoring anyone else's property. I'm simply making sure that no one trespasses on mine. And the cameras are there for my safety, not for your convenience or anyone else's. Karen shot me a look of disdain, but I could see the other board members starting to shift uncomfortably. I had the facts on my side, and they knew it. Greg spoke up next, his tone a little softer. I understand your position, Mr. My last name, but we do need to consider the complaints of the neighbors. Perhaps there is a way to find a middle ground here. I shook my head. I'm not compromising on this. The cameras stay. If you try to take them down, I will take legal action. I've already consulted with my lawyer, and I know my rights. The HOA can't make demands about my private property. The room went silent. I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air. Karen looked like she was about to lose it, but she stayed quiet, watching me like a hawk. Greg cleared his throat. All right, well, we'll need to take this under advisement. We'll be in touch. I nodded, knowing that this wasn't the end, but I had made my point. I wasn't going to back down, and they knew it. The HOA couldn't force me to remove my cameras. And as the meeting wrapped up, I walked out of there with my head held high. I knew I had done everything right. The following days were quiet. No more letters from the HOA, no more complaints from my neighbors. It seemed like the HOA had realized they were on shaky ground. They weren't going to win this fight. And the best part? I could see that Karen, who had been so smug just a few days earlier, was starting to back off. But just when I thought it was all over, I got another letter from the HOA. This time, they weren't threatening fines. They weren't demanding I remove the cameras. No, this time, they had a proposal. They wanted to negotiate. And that's when I realized they were finally ready to accept that they couldn't win. They were backing down. But would I accept their offer? And how far would I go to make sure this issue was truly resolved? When I received that letter from the HOA, I honestly wasn't sure what to think. Part of me wanted to laugh because it was clear that they were finally realizing that they couldn't just bully me into submission. But another part of me was curious. What did they want from me? Why had they shifted from demands and threats to an offer of negotiation? I had to find out. The letter stated that they were willing to meet with me again to discuss a solution regarding the security cameras. They assured me it wasn't going to be another confrontation and that they wanted to find a way to address everyone's concerns. They claimed they had spoken to some of my neighbors and wanted to get everyone on the same page. At this point, I didn't trust the HOA. Not one bit. They had shown their true colors, and I wasn't about to let them off the hook just because they were now playing nice. But I also wasn't going to ignore the fact that they were starting to back down. I decided to accept the meeting, but only on my terms. I wasn't going to show up unprepared or let them twist the situation in their favor again. I called my lawyer and had a conversation about my options. He told me that it was likely the HOA wanted to resolve the issue without escalating it further. They probably realized that they didn't have the legal right to interfere with my property. The meeting was set for the following week. I showed up with a clear mindset. I wasn't going to compromise on my cameras, but I also wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted this over with. When I arrived at the HOA office, I could see that the mood was different this time. There were no angry faces, no threats being thrown around. In fact, it almost felt like they were trying to make amends. Greg greeted me at the door, his handshake warmer than before. Mr. My last name, thank you for coming, he said, his voice much more cordial than the last time we spoke. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us today. I didn't say much at first. I was keeping my guard up. I had been through too much with these people to let my guard down now. The meeting started, and this time, there were no loud accusations or demands. The board members, including Karen, were quieter, more subdued. They went over some of the concerns they had received from the neighbors. Most of them were about the cameras being unsightly or too intrusive. But there was no mention of legal action or fines this time, which was a huge shift from before. Greg looked at me and said, "We know this issue has caused tension in the neighborhood, and we want to find a solution that works for everyone. We understand that your security is important, but we need to address the community's concerns as well." I could tell that he was trying to sound reasonable, but I wasn't fooled. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to save face. They knew they were in the wrong, and they just wanted to make this go away without losing any more power. "I understand that people are uncomfortable with the cameras," I replied, "but I've made sure they are within the law, and they're protecting my property. If anyone feels uncomfortable, they can speak to me directly, but that doesn't change the fact that these cameras are staying." Greg nodded, clearly expecting this response. "We're not asking you to take the cameras down. We just want to make sure they're not causing unnecessary tension in the neighborhood. Perhaps there's a way to reposition them, or at least make them less visible." I was quiet for a moment. I could tell that they were trying to get me to compromise, but I wasn't going to give in. My cameras weren't going anywhere, and I wasn't going to move them just to please a few neighbors. "No," I said firmly. "The cameras are fine where they are. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do, protecting my property. If people are really that bothered by them, they can deal with it. I'm not making any changes." There was a slight pause. I could see Karen's face turning red, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she were trying to hold back her anger. But I wasn't going to be intimidated anymore. Finally, Greg spoke again. "All right, Mr. My last name, we'll take your position into account. We just want to make sure we're respecting everyone's privacy and comfort. Perhaps we can come to a mutual understanding moving forward." I could see that they were trying to soften their stance, but I wasn't about to let them get away with pretending like they had done nothing wrong. I'm happy to respect everyone's privacy, but I also expect the same in return. If anyone trespasses on my property or tries to interfere with my security system, I will take legal action. I'm not asking for permission to protect my home. At that point, Karen finally spoke up, her voice dripping with frustration. "This is ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "You're making this whole thing so much harder than it needs to be. We've all been trying to keep the neighborhood nice, but now you're making it feel like a battle. You're not the only one living here." I stayed calm, even though her words were getting under my skin. "I'm not making this a battle, Karen. I'm just protecting my property. If that bothers you, I'm sorry, but it's my right." The room went silent for a few moments, and I could tell that Karen's frustration was starting to boil over. But Greg stepped in before things could escalate. "We'll take your stance into account, Mr. My last name," he said, his voice calmer than before. "It seems like we're at an impasse here. I think it's clear that we're not going to reach a compromise today. We'll have to review the situation and get back to you." I nodded, feeling a small sense of victory. They hadn't won, and they knew it. As the meeting wrapped up, I stood up, ready to leave. I wasn't expecting an immediate resolution, but I knew that this was a win for me. They had backed down. They had no real authority to tell me what to do with my property, and they were finally starting to realize it. I walked out of that meeting knowing that I had fought for what was right, and that the HOA had finally learned not to mess with me. But there was one last piece of the puzzle left to resolve. How would they handle this moving forward? And would they really leave me alone? Or would they try to escalate things again? A week passed, and nothing happened. No letters, no calls from the HOA, not even a whisper of complaint from the neighbors. It was almost too quiet. I had expected some sort of retaliation after the meeting, but all was calm, and I started to feel like maybe this was finally over. Then, one afternoon, as I was sitting in my living room, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was from my lawyer. "Hey, it's Jim. I've got some news," he said, sounding a little too casual for my liking. "The HOA is taking a different approach. They've decided to back off for now, but they want to make sure you understand something. This isn't over." I sat up straight. "What do you mean, not over?" I asked, my heart rate picking up. "They're trying to move the goalposts now. Apparently, they're going to start pushing a different narrative, that you're somehow creating a neighborhood nuisance by having these cameras. They're looking into whether they can use this as leverage to put more pressure on you. They're trying to make it look like it's not about the cameras, but about the community impact." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. So they're still playing games then? Exactly. They're trying to stir things up, but they're smart enough to realize they can't win on the legal front. This is just them trying to find another way to back you into a corner. I laughed bitterly. Well, they're not going to win. Not on my watch. Jim laughed along with me. I didn't think so either, but I just wanted to give you the heads up. Stay vigilant and don't let them get to you. That night, as I sat down for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tested. The HOA had backed down, sure, but they clearly weren't done. I had no doubt in my mind that they would keep pushing, trying to find another angle to get me to back down. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. As I thought about it, I realized something important. This wasn't just about cameras anymore. It wasn't about security or convenience. It was about control. The HOA had gotten too comfortable in thinking they could dictate the lives of the residents. They wanted to push their power, but I wasn't about to let that happen. The next day, I took action. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for another letter from the HOA. I wasn't going to give them the chance to think they could wear me down. I called up a local news outlet that I knew had covered HOA-related stories before. I told them about the ongoing battle with the HOA and how they were trying to violate my rights by demanding the removal of my cameras. Within hours, the news station had contacted me, and a reporter was scheduled to visit. When they arrived, I gave them the full story. How the HOA had tried to force me to take down my cameras, how they had backed off, and now how they were once again trying to manipulate the situation to make me look like the villain. The reporter was all ears, asking the right questions, taking notes, and even filming a few segments outside my house. I made sure to show the cameras, explain how they were positioned, and talk about the legal protection I had to keep them in place. By the time the interview was over, I knew it was only a matter of time before the story would go public. And when it did, I could already imagine the fallout. The HOA wasn't going to get away with it. The next day, the segment aired on the local news. It wasn't long before the story went viral. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up started reaching out, sending me messages of support. People from other neighborhoods, who had dealt with similar HOA issues, started commenting on social media, telling me their own horror stories. And then, things got interesting. A few days after the broadcast, I got a call from the HOA. This time, it was Greg, and he didn't sound nearly as confident as before. "Mr. My last name," he said, his voice a little shaky. "We saw the news story, and I just wanted to let you know that after careful consideration, we've decided to drop the matter." I couldn't help but smile. "Really? Just like that?" "Yes," he said, almost too quickly. "We understand now that the cameras are within your rights, and we're sorry for any stress this may have caused you." It felt like a win, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been pushed around by an HOA. But I didn't stop there. The next day, I wrote a letter to the HOA, thanking them for finally respecting my rights, but also reminding them that they had overstepped their bounds in the first place. I made it clear that I would no longer tolerate any attempts to control my property or my life. And just like that, it was over. The HOA stopped bothering me. The cameras stayed up, and I never heard from them again. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my back porch, enjoying a quiet evening, when I saw Karen walking by with a few of her friends. She didn't look at my house, but I caught the look on her face. It was the same expression she had when she first came to confront me, but now it was different. It was a mixture of defeat and resignation. I smiled to myself. The cameras weren't just a tool for protection. They were a symbol of standing my ground, of not letting anyone, whether it was Karen, the HOA, or anyone else, push me around. And for the first time in a long while, I felt peace. My property was mine. No one was going to take that away from me. The HOA had learned a hard lesson, and I was done letting them control my life.